Within hours of Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, hardline media inside Iran were not attacking Washington first. They were attacking their own foreign minister. That is where this story begins. Not with the protests in the street, not with the shortages, not with the missing supreme leader, with that. Because the real story is not simply that Iran is unstable. The real story is that the Islamic Republic may have reached the point where it can no longer explain its own actions to the people and institutions that were built to defend it. And once a regime loses the power to explain itself to its own base, every other crisis inside it accelerates. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. For 47 years, the regime survived on one central promise. It never promised comfort. It never promised prosperity. It never promised normal life. It promised something else. It promised that suffering had meaning, that sanctions, shortages, war, isolation, and sacrifice were not pointless pain, but the price of dignity. We do not surrender. We do not bow. We do not negotiate from weakness. We endure because endurance itself proves our legitimacy. That was the story. Then the Strait of Hormuz was reopened without any visible strategic gain, and the story cracked. That is why the source text keeps pulling us back to that moment. Not because the strait is just a shipping issue, not because oil markets alone explain what is happening inside Tehran, but because Hormuz was the last clean symbol the regime could still point to and say, whatever else you think of us, we still hold a lever the world must respect. We can still impose pressure. We can still force Washington to care. We can still make global markets move. Then that lever was handed back quietly. Without a visible victory, without a clear bargain the public could understand, without a credible explanation from the top, that is what detonated the rest of the system. Because once the state gave up its last strong symbol of leverage, without visibly getting anything back, different groups inside Iran all arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. The Guard concluded leverage had been discarded. Hardliners concluded the language of resistance had become empty. The public concluded years of sacrifice had bought nothing. And the clergy concluded the state no longer knew how to preserve the dignity it had demanded others die for. That is why this crisis is not one crisis. It is three internal wars happening simultaneously. The first internal war is between the civilian state and the military state beneath it. The source text is very clear here. Iran still has a president. It still has formal institutions. It still has the appearance of constitutional order. But those institutions no longer seem to contain real command. Pezeshkian can speak, but he can be publicly contradicted. He can hold office, but not determine the line. He can stand at the front of the state while the actual direction of the state is being shaped somewhere else. That somewhere else matters. The source points to an unelected three-man center of gravity, Vahedi, Zolgadar, Mohsen Rezaei, all IRGC, origin figures, all men shaped by war, security, revolutionary coercion, and decades of confrontation. None of them elected, none of them carrying clerical legitimacy, yet they appear to be functioning as the real executive core of the regime. That means the Islamic Republic is still wearing the shell of a hybrid political system, while increasingly behaving like an emergency military directorate. That is a major difference, because this is no longer just the old Iranian story of competing factions inside one revolutionary order. This is the story of an order changing its actual operating principle under crisis. The civilians still sign, still appear, still speak, but they no longer visibly decide. That is not ordinary authoritarian drift. That is regime mutation. The second internal war is between the military security state and the clerical state. This may be even more dangerous because it cuts directly into the regime's founding claim. The Islamic Republic was supposed to be ruled through clerical sovereignty, ruled by the jurists, not simply force with religious language, but force justified and embodied by a sacred hierarchy. The supreme leader was not just an executive, he was the point where political command and theological legitimacy fused. Now imagine what that looks like when the man at the top goes missing. The country is effectively managed by a security committee, and the clerics can do little but watch. The source text understands what that means. If the state can continue, however, shakily, while the clergy is displaced and the guard governs by default, then the hardest question in the whole system can no longer be suppressed. Was this ever really a clerical republic, or was it always a security state using clerical legitimacy as its outer skin? That question is devastating, because if the Islamic part of the Islamic Republic starts to look ornamental, then decades of repression, sacrifice, and rule by decree lose their most important justification. The mullahs are not just losing power, they are watching the argument for their power dissolve. The third internal war is in society itself. This is where outside analysis usually gets lazy. People see the shortages and think they understand the whole thing. They do not. Yes, the economic damage is severe. Power cuts, fuel lines, empty ATMs, medicine shortages, food inflation, closing businesses, suspended treatments. The source text makes clear that the stress is real and accelerating. The president reportedly warned that if a ceasefire is not reached, the economy could collapse within weeks. But the reason this is politically explosive is not merely that life is hard. Life in Iran has been hard before. The reason it is explosive now is that hardship has stopped feeling meaningful. That is the crucial shift. For years, the regime could convert pain into mission. It could tell families that what they were enduring served something larger: dignity, resistance, national independence, defiance. The public did not need to be comfortable if it still believed the suffering had a point. Once Hormuz was reopened without visible gain, that logic collapsed. And once the logic collapsed, the public's anger changed quality. The regime is not only facing economic frustration, it is facing betrayed believers. That is what makes the Shah chants so important in the source text. They are not just opposition theater. They are historical reversal. The Islamic Republic exists because the monarchy was overthrown and delegitimized as the past. If people are now openly invoking the Shah, then they are not simply demanding reform. They are saying the revolution itself may have been the wrong turn. That is an existential insult to the regime's founding myth. Now add the most destabilizing factor of all: the supreme leader has effectively vanished. For 35 days, according to the source, Mojtaba Khamenei was not a visible sovereign. No real public appearances, no authoritative speech, no embodied command during the most serious legitimacy crisis of his short tenure. There are reports of injury, but politically, the precise medical explanation matters less than the effect. The effect is vacancy, and vacancy at the top is deadly in a system built on concentrated symbolic authority. This is where the story becomes much more than unrest. Hard regimes can survive public hatred. They can survive ugly crackdowns. They can survive sanctions. They can survive war. But they struggle to survive visible absence at the apex when every level below is already under pressure. Because once the top goes dark, lower institutions start behaving differently. The president hedges, the clergy worries, the public radicalizes, the guard starts calculating. Everyone begins asking, quietly or openly, who actually speaks for the state. Now that is why the most important development in the source text is not the protests by themselves. It is the IRGC whisper campaign. If senior guard figures are now privately circulating the idea that Mojtaba should resign, then the crisis has reached the level authoritarian systems fear most. The level where the institution that exists to defend the throne begins to ask whether the throne itself has become a liability. That is a regime-ending kind of question. Not because it guarantees immediate collapse, it does not, but because once the Praetorian Corps starts thinking that way, the state's future stops being decided only by the street. It starts being decided by a calculation inside the coercive apparatus itself. Is the ruler still useful? Is the symbol at the top still helping preserve the system? Or is preserving the system now beginning to require movement against the symbol? History gets very dangerous at that point. The source adds one more layer that makes this worse. Paranoia inside the guard. Figures once thought safe have been reached. Internal security people have been hit. Communications are being restricted. Questions of infiltration and leaks are spreading through the security structure. That matters because repression machines usually do not first crack from public rage. They crack when the people inside them stop trusting the channels above and around them. Once that happens, the state still looks hard from the outside, but inside it begins to hollow. That is what this story is really about. not simply protests, not simply economics, not simply succession, not simply mojtaba. It is about narrative collapse at the exact moment the apex has gone dark and the coercive core is starting to recalculate. The regime can probably still arrest people, it can still crack heads, it can still stage rallies, it can still wave flags, it can still shout slogans, but a regime like this does not ultimately survive on flags and slogans. It survives on belief distributed across three groups at once: the people who justify it, the people who protect it, and the people who suffer for it. The source text suggests all three are beginning to doubt at once. The clerics no longer fully own the state. The guard no longer fully trusts the apex. The public no longer fully believes the pain has purpose. That combination is lethal because a regime can survive shortages. It can survive sanctions. It can survive war. It can survive humiliation. What it cannot easily survive is the moment when its own guardians start doubting the story that once made all the suffering tolerable. That is the threshold Iran now seems to be approaching. And once a regime reaches that threshold, the shell can still stand for a while. Courts still function. Television still broadcasts. Security forces still patrol. The forms of the state remain. But underneath the forms, the thing that made them feel inevitable begins to leave belief. And when belief begins leaving the guardians of a revolutionary regime, collapse no longer depends only on the street. It depends on whether the men with power decide that saving the system and saving the man at the top are no longer the same thing. That is the question. Now hanging over Tehran, and that is why I would leave this story here, the Islamic Republic may not break first because the crowds got louder. It may break because the men who are built to defend the throne have begun asking whether the throne is now the thing they must move past to save themselves.